appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.
Good evening, folks. I'm Brent, Holland from Night Fright. Folks, we're speaking this evening with Colin McSween, and Colin's got a good book out called At the Door of Memory, Aubrey Reich and the Assassination of President Kennedy. You can pick it up at www.jfklancer.com. I'll give that again, www.jfklancer.com. Colin, I want to go back in and ask you about the weapons now, because that's another area of your expertise. You know, everybody keeps talking about that Mannlicher Carcano.
Right.
I had Tom Lipscomb on, and Tom's an ex-sniper, and he was saying he was trying to recreate the Oswald shooting, and he couldn't do it, never mind with a stupid bolt-action rifle. He couldn't do it with the weapons that he was given. Any further comments on that? Any perspectives?
My Mannlicher Carcano is lying at my feet here.
Oh, you have one?
There's no camera, otherwise I'd pick it up and show you. Well, I'll put it this way. This was an Italian-manufactured weapon. They had munitions factories, I believe, in 3 different cities. Mine happens to be from an Italian city called Terni, Italy, which is Terni. For the most part, many of them were 6.5 millimeter, and what that means is that the diameter of the bullets, or the diameter of the inside of the bore of the rifle, was 6.5 millimeters, and if anybody is unfamiliar with metric measurements, all you need to do is look at this paper on a cigarette, and the lines on the paper of a cigarette are 1 millimeter apart. So just mark off 6.5 of those lines in space between them, and that gives you an idea how small it is. It's roughly 26 caliber, so it's not much bigger than a 22. The guns were manufactured from 1891 until 1941. At which time they were no longer in production. So by 1963, the guns were already 22 years obsolete. It's my understanding that the ammunition that was available for them at the time was ex-World War II military surplus, full copper jacket, and the ammunition that Oswald allegedly had purchased and had and used in the shooting was manufactured by a company called the Western Cartridge Company. The weapon was allegedly purchased by mail order from a store in Chicago, Illinois, called Klein's Sporting Goods for about $12.50 or $12.95. I don't have the clipping in front of me. And people say, well, boy, that was sure cheap. Well, you have to remember that, yeah, it was maybe relatively cheap, but in 1963, when somebody with a job like Oswald's at the book depository was making $1.25 an hour, that's a little bit better than a day's wage. And I think twice before spending a day's wage on something. So it wasn't necessarily cheap. It is certainly by today's standards. The problem with the guns were they were oftentimes called the humanitarian rifles because they allegedly never hurt anyone on purpose. It's kind of funny, but they were almost laughed at, as it were, by the German army in World War II when Hitler and Mussolini formed an alliance. I think the reason that Hitler didn't go ahead and spend the money to build Mauser rifles to equip the Italian army with is for the same reason the United States haven't taken over Canada, right? It's the, what point is there? It's, I'm really going to get a lot of heat over that one.
Don't worry about it.
Basically, the Germans had very sophisticated weapons, super sophisticated weapons. One of the best weapons in the world, even to this day, even among bolt-action rifles, which is extremely old technology. One of the best rifles in the world is a large-bore Mauser, M-A-U-S-E-R, military rifle, which is what Kennedy's assassination weapon was identified as for almost the first 48 hours after the assassination.
That's right. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. And if you want to get into a discussion on this and you want to look at newspapers, I have a presentation in PowerPoint called Exhibit A, and it can take anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on how much discussion people want to get into. Normally, it's about 45 minutes to 50 minutes, and I explore the different type of weapons implicated in the assassination and the available evidence based on Dallas police tapes, newspaper and reporter and deputy sheriff's documentation bearing out the fact that there were possibly 3 rifles found in the schoolbook depository. But getting back to the Carcano, a small bore, fairly mediocre rifle, even by the standards of 1963, was considered to be a low-velocity weapon with low-velocity rounds, especially if these were cartridge or rounds of ammunition that might have been manufactured 25 years or 22 years before, that were probably sitting on a shelf in a store somewhere. I mean, we don't know what the shelf life was like on that weapon or those bullets. We do know from the autopsy, we learned from the autopsy, that the bullet that struck President Kennedy in the back didn't even penetrate the pleura on the inside lining at the back of his chest. That's a very weak round. I would argue to say that that shot probably was maybe the only shot that was fired from the Oswald rifle, and it bears pointing out that the Warren Commission star eyewitness to the assassination, who was located right across from the book depository, only heard 2 shots from there. So whether one shot hit Connolly and one shot hit Kennedy, if those were rear shots, okay, let's allow for that, just to tuck that issue aside. But when you start reading the autopsy and you start reading things like the death certificate from Dallas, and people in Dallas are saying he was shot with a high-powered rifle, which is exactly what it says in the Texas Department of Health and Bureau of Vital Statistics. It says shot by a high-powered rifle. The Carcano is not a high-powered rifle, even by the standards of 1955, much less 63. If you read the autopsy report and the summary notes from the autopsy, which were published in Appendix 8 also in the Warren report, it says that hit with a high-velocity projectile. Well, the 6.5 Carcano round is not a high-velocity projectile. That's a good point. Yes,
so you have medical certification from Dallas County existing in print, and you have information from D.C. and the District of Columbia and the Bethesda Naval Medical Hospital bearing out the fact that the president was struck with high-velocity weapon or a high-velocity projectile delivered by a high-powered weapon.
Folks, we're speaking with Colin McSween. He's got a great book out called At the Door of Memory, Aubrey Reich and the Assassination of President Kennedy. Pick it up at www.jfklancer.com. You had mentioned before some of your expertise is on the car. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that, because I don't know much about that.
The car's got an interesting little history. It was a 1961 Lincoln Continental. A lot of people have mistakenly identified it as a 62 or a 63 or even a 64. The car was actually being designed as the next White House car, and the plans for the car were actually being drafted by the Ford Motor Company in 1956. The car was actually being initially designed as the 1961 Thunderbird, and when you look at the front end of a 1961 Lincoln Continental, it looks very similar to a 62 T-Bird and 63 T-Bird. Now, Kennedy's future Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was the president of the Ford Motor Company, and he made the decision that that car was going to be the 1961 Lincoln.
Whoa, I didn't know this.
Yeah, just a little bit of trivia. But there's some really fascinating books out. There's one called The Cars of Lincoln Mercury, and it's a tremendous book. It's just loaded with information on the development of the car, not only that car, but dozens of others as well, and deals with the entire history of the Lincoln Motor Car Company. The Lincoln Motor Car Company was established in respect and in commemoration of Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th president of the United States, who was assassinated in 1865. The people that founded the Lincoln Motor Car Company wanted to establish a car that spoke of the elegance and the stately qualities of what they perceived to be the greatest American president to that point. And the car was developed, and the motor car company was developed in 1917, which is the year that President Kennedy and Governor Connolly were both born. You know, a little bit of trivia there thrown in as well for those that are so inclined. There are other books available on it, of course, as well, and there's a lot of information on the internet. If you go to a site called SS100X, there's a really good essay written by Pamela McElwain Brown, and there's some really amazing photographs of the car and its various manifestations, including some that were taken in the White House garage on the Saturday, November 23rd.
Did they reveal anything?
Oh, they do. They tell you a lot, because even though the Secret Service cleaned off the rear trunk deck and a lot of other aspects of the car, there's two color photographs that you can click and pull up on that site that show you what the rear seat looked like after the shooting. And it's pretty disgusting. Where the president was sitting, if the upholstery's all clean and everything to his left, where Mrs. Kennedy had been, is all crimson.
Where he fell over onto her lap, yeah.
Yeah, the 61 Lincoln was delivered. One model was selected for the White House car, and it was sent to a company called Hess and Eisenhart, and it was in Cincinnati, Ohio. And Hess and Eisenhart's company took this 1961 Lincoln, and they cut the body in two places. They cut it between where the front and rear doors meet, and they cut it immediately behind the rear doors, between the rear door and where the rear fender starts. And they put a 6-inch extension between the front and rear door, and then they did about an 18-inch, what they call aft door extension, which means behind the door extension. You've got about an 18-inch stretch behind where the rear doors hinge, and the doors hinge toward the back because they're suicide doors. They open frontward. Then there's a 6-inch extension, as I say, between the two doors, and then where the extended bumper work was added onto the rear deck with the Continental kit and everything, you ended up with a car that was basically about 21 feet and a couple of inches in length. The car was equipped with a couple of optional enclosures. One of them happened to be made of plexiglass, which they just simply called bubble top. And it was mistakenly assumed that that bubble top was bulletproof. It wasn't bulletproof. It was plexiglass, and it would have shattered if you shot it with any sort of a medium velocity bullet. But the press tended to overplay that and call it bulletproof because the White House had addressed it as a protective bubble top. Well, they meant protective meant that it kept the elements off.
I was going to say the rain off.
And whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
President Kennedy didn't care for the bubble top. There is some footage available of him riding in it with the bubble top on, but he preferred to have it off because it tended to do funny things to the air conditioning, and it oftentimes just became like a sauna, and they decided the easy thing to do was either put the permanent hard shell roof on for days where it was inclement, or if it was going to be a nice day, take the roof off altogether. On the day of the assassination, the plexiglass roof was on, the bubble top, and it had a vinyl cover that snapped on at grommets. What they did was, when it was pretty evident at Love Field on the morning of the 22nd, fairly early in the morning, that it was going to be a nice day, the president apparently sent orders forward that the roof should be removed. And the roof was removed, and the roof would come off in pieces, and it was actually stored inside the trunk. The trunk deck was actually about 3 inches higher than a conventional 1961 Lincoln. And I know I rebuilt a 61 Lincoln by hand about 34 years ago or so now.
Wow.
And paid a lot of attention to all those details and got very heavily into the study of this particular car. I should mention that in 1962, the car was fitted with 1958 series Lincoln Premier hubcaps, and the front end was cosmetically upgraded by the addition of a 1962 grille. The way the car appeared on November 22nd is a little different than the way it appeared when it was delivered to the White House in June of 1961. And President Kennedy, of course, his favorite color was dark blue, and his car was dark blue while he had it.
How many cylinders was it, just out of curiosity?
It was a 430 cubic inch Windsor motor. It was a V8, and it had a 4-barrel Rochester, I believe, or a Hawley. I'd have to double check and see what carburetor was on there.
It was a beast.
Oh, it was big, yeah. I mean, I had the same motor in mine, a 430 cubic inch V8. Which is a bit smaller than what the Lincolns had. In the 70s, they had 460s.
Was there any safety features added to the car? For example, maybe added steel in the doors or something like that? Or
well, there was some limited armor plating in the body. It's my understanding that it did have some armor plating. It's interesting, though, that the Chief Executive of the United States didn't have a car that was anywhere near as well equipped as what Hitler had 25 years before. It was equipped with a lot of nice little options. You know, it had a rear seat that by electricity typically on a set of gears would elevate some 18 to 30 inches, so the president could be sitting almost flush with the top of the trunk deck. The side windows were apparently bullet resistant. I don't know to what extent, but of course they were rolled down. Jackie Kennedy had her window up, I think about a quarter or a third of the way up to help sort of break down the wind a bit to keep it from blowing her hat off. There was apparently a windshield that was in a retractable windshield that would separate the driver's compartment from the passenger compartment. A lot of people have debated whether that window was up or down during the shooting. It's my understanding that that window was down.
That's what it looks like to me also, but... Yeah.
And, I mean, some people have argued and tried to persuade, and it was up and here's the proof and everything else, and they try and use all manner of photographs to establish. I don't really think it makes much difference.
Now, the front windshield, there is some speculation that indeed had a bullet entrance wound in it. Any idea if that was bulletproof? Because I guess that would put the rest of the theory.
Yeah, no, I don't think the front window was bulletproof, and it's hard to say. I've seen photos of that crack in the windshield, and whether that was caused by a fragment of a bullet from one of the shots to the men in the car. I mean, it would be great to go back in time and stand there and examine it for ourselves. I understand there are people that were in the emergency bay at Parkland that day that swear up and down that there was in fact a hole there, and apparently some fellow actually went up and poked a pencil through it. I would have a hard time seeing anybody being permitted to get that close to the car, so I would think that's probably a mild exaggeration. And I suppose I know that the damage to the chrome over the windshield on the interior, there's a dent in several photos that have been published. I had a 1967 Barracuda convertible, and when I would put the top on the car, there were two pull-down brackets that would secure the roof to the top of the windshield, and the pull-down brackets in my car created that exact same dent on the passenger side in the chrome on the inside of the windshield in my Barracuda. And I remember looking at that dent thinking, wow, that's just like the one in Kennedy's car that everybody says was caused by a bullet. I forgot where I've read it now, but it's my understanding that someone in the Secret Service did attest that was a dent that did in fact result from one such attempt at re-securing the roof on one of his trips somewhere. I've forgotten exactly where. They didn't necessarily fix that or go ahead and replace it. It was kind of an unnecessary expense, really. It wasn't something that really showed, and anybody looking at the car as it drove by would never notice it. As far as the crack in the windshield goes, I really don't have an explanation for that. If it was caused by a bullet, great. I'll concede and say, yeah, okay, it was caused by a bullet or it was caused by a fragment. You're going to get others that are going to say, well, it was caused by a bullet coming to the car from the front, and of course that opens up a whole other topic of discussion. I do know that the car was sent back very quickly for rebuilding by White House officials within the week of the assassination, and it was returned for LBJ's use in the spring of 1964. I know that we have film footage available that shows LBJ traveling in the car during the presidential campaign of 1964. He had it painted black. They cosmetically updated the car significantly to cosmetically resemble more of a 1963 or 64 Lincoln.
You also have a connection with the X-Files, which I was a big fan of that show.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to...
story behind that?
Yeah, you want to just tell folks about that?
Like, you ask me anything, it's going to become a long answer. But anyhow, I was... first time I consulted in drama was for a Broadway production called Les Miserables, and that was in the area of cosmetics and certain effects they were trying to achieve, and that was an area that I was quite gifted in. 1993, I was contacted by what is now Global Television on the 30th anniversary of the assassination. They wanted to do a television special, so we ended up taping a big segment for the evening news here in my home in Abbotsford, and that was telecast at 6 p.m. evening news as well as 11 p.m., and it was about a 6 or 7 minute news spot that ran nationwide. About 3 years later, I was called again to consult on a movie called Ellen Foster, and I directed a deathbed scene as well as what we call a removal or recovery of a body, as well as a graveside scene, and I was quite involved in those aspects and worked with some fairly big stars. And we got rained out on that, and we were tucked in a tent for a while, and the audio technician on this movie had been the audio technician when we had done the previous thing on national television on the assassination. Plus, this fellow happened to know my mother. I mean, talk about a small world.
Wow.
He lived a few blocks from my mother and knew her. So he started asking me questions about the assassination, and I mean, I started answering questions, and next thing you know, I've got about 20 or 30 people standing there listening. And later in the day, when the weather broke and we got back on location to start filming again, a few people approached me, and they asked asked for my card, and they said, we'd like to talk to you about doing an episode on a TV series to do with the assassination of President Kennedy. I got hired, make a long story even longer, I got hired essentially as a consultant for the cars to be used in the restaging of the assassination. Then they approached me and asked me if they could rent some of my personal inventory. I have presidential flags, limousine flags, rifles, and whatever else. Quite a lot of stuff. Actually, I could usually fill a modest-sized school gymnasium if you give me enough time to get it set up. I got talking to them. They decided to hire me to consult for wardrobe as well as props. The only thing I didn't consult on was the storyline and the script and the location, which is too bad because they made a lot of mistakes in the storyline and went with sort of a shooting scenario which I didn't really follow or agree with, but I didn't find that out till I saw the finished product on TV. Part of the episode we did was called Things Really Did Go Well in DEALEY PLAZA, and we restaged the assassination in Vancouver, BC in an area that was similar to DEALEY PLAZA, at least enough that we could cheat it. And they used real Vancouver City police officers on motorcycle. They dressed them in Dallas uniforms, and they had real sidearms and were fully loaded and everything because we were rolling in a public street in a sequence that was going to be obvious to anybody looking at us what we were doing. I got called about a week before the day of the filming, and they said, we want you here for the day of the film when we shoot the assassination thing. So they called me in for wardrobe fit, and when I got there, I said, I think you've got the wrong person. They said, no, we want you to play the chauffeur, William Robert Greer. Well, my middle names are William Robert, and of course, I'd had recurring nightmares as a child that I had been in the front seat of the car during the shooting, had been powerless to do anything about it. This was a nightmare that came to pass in 1996 in October in Vancouver. And I think when it really hit me, what really hit me was when I slid in behind the wheel and I adjusted my rearview mirror. And, well, you never guess what I see in the rearview mirror. I've got the Kennedys.
Oh, my God.
And the red roses, and we've got the Oliver Stone wardrobe. This was detailed. It was authentic. It was just amazing.
In that episode, I saw it, by the way, the smoking man is in the sewer.
Yeah.
Taking a frontal shot. That was a theory that was kind of, I don't know about that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it squares up with what I know from what I've talked about with some of the Dallas doctors about the trajectory of the headshot. It doesn't square up with that. It's my understanding that a former employee with the Navy who had worked at Bethesda had died shortly before they did that episode and had left some sort of a statement or something in his diary or some kind of a statement pertaining to the fact that, in his opinion or somebody's opinion, that this is possibly where the shot had originated. And other people had postulated and put forth that idea back in 1964 and 65. There is one storm drain that does provide a lot of grounds for some discussion and argument, and it's not the storm drain under the sidewalk. It's an opening into the storm drain system that is behind where the stockade fence runs into the concrete of the overpass. That whole pit is being filled in with large boulders now, but at one time you could go and stand in that opening and remove a slat in the fence, and you had an incredible view of DEALEY PLAZA and what would have been a totally plausible shot to Kennedy's head.
Did you know that Sergio Arquea Smith was found with blueprints of the storm drain
network?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jim Giogenio was telling me that when he was telling the story of...
Oh, Jim's an amazing guy.
Oh, yeah.
He's brilliant.
Oh, absolutely.
I feel like a dwarf next to someone like him.
Oh, I don't know. You did very well tonight, my friend.
Well, it's good for me to feel like a dwarf because I'm so flipping tall. But, you know, I was going to say what you might get a kick out of is during the filming, we actually showed that scene where the Dallas County Waterworks guy gets out of the blue van and he's got his bag of goodies, his rifle and everything, and he disappears into that storm tunnel.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the Kennedys, quote unquote, and I sat on the back of a flatbed truck eating lunch watching them shoot that. We'd already shot the assassination footage, and then that scene was being shot later in the day. And so, just to show you, they don't do things chronologically in film. They can really get away with a lot. But I think what was even cuter was the guy that played Kennedy. His name was Mark Lincoln. We were walking from the wardrobe area over to the cars. I said to him, I said, how about a drive in the city, Mr. President? And I hate to be comical about this, but I'll put this in. The actor looked at me and he said, well, I need that like a hole in the head. And he did not mean it to be funny. But the irony just hit us, and we just kind of went very sober, and we just walked to the car. Nobody was laughing. And it wasn't until later on in the day when it kind of hit me, and I thought, boy, that was sick. You know, like it was totally unintentional.
I understand.
But it's just one of those things, you know. But again, for me, it was one of my worst nightmares come true. And to sit there, like I literally froze, and somebody came over and said, "Are you going to be all right?" And I said, "Oh, I'll take a minute or two." But the other thing they had me do was they decided to show the sequence of the headshot, and this was complete with the spray of the blood and everything. And it never made it past the editor's blade. It never got shown on TV. They asked me if I would redo the president's fatal head wound, if I would rebuild it for them. So I actually did the cosmetic and artistic work on the actor's head to redo the president's head wound. But there was about 30 people watching while I did it. It took about 40 minutes, and I used pieces of styrofoam wedge and some spirit gum adhesive and all kinds of little things. And I had the blast hole out the back just the way Dr. McClellan drew it in 1966 for Josiah Thompson's book, and the same way that Aubrey drew it in his book. But it was interesting because they told me, just do a little color dot about the size of a quarter. And I said to them, I said, "Well, aren't you saying that he shot from the front?" They said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, you're not going to get a little color dot on the back of his head the size of a quarter." I said, "This area is going to be knocked off." And they thought, "Oh, gee." You know, so, you know, sometimes even the people that are making a program, you need to sort of push a few buttons and pose a few questions. Because, I mean, the director can have his way and fire you and do it the way he wants. So you have to be pretty diplomatic.
Absolutely. Colin, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to come back to Aubrey Reich. How is he doing now? Is he still haunted by those
I don't know that
experiences
he's haunted. I know that, you know, he frequently, like a lot of witnesses, you know, gets a little bit exasperated and tired when people, you know, come up to him at functions and stuff and say, "Now, this is what you saw and this is what you heard, right?" And oftentimes people approach these people and they try and tell them what they saw and heard, or, you know, and instead of just approaching them and saying, "Tell me your story. You know, what did you see? What did you hear?" But he enjoys meeting people. He's a people person. He's very friendly. He's not proud or arrogant. He doesn't have any airs or think he's anybody high and mighty or special. He's got the heart and compassion of a very humble servant. You know, he says, "I just did what I did the best way I knew how in some of the most terrible moments of human existence."
Absolutely.
He's in his 70s. He's fully retired, enjoys what he can of his life, and he and his wife Glenda are quite happily settled, and their son Larry is doing well for himself. And I haven't talked to him now. I meant to talk to him this week, but I've been so busy with work and everything that I just haven't connected with him. And then with the program I did last week with Dr. McClelland, I didn't get back to him at all. But I last talked to him about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we are anticipating being on a television show, and I can't tell you anything more about it than that.
Well, send me an email when you know.
I will keep you posted.
Please do.
Yes.
What's next for Colin McSween?
A Dallas police officer, now retired, that was involved in one aspect or another with the motorcade, has strongly urged me to write my findings of the medical data based on what I've studied in the medical documents out of Appendix 8 in the Warren Commission report, which bear out that there were 2 shots from the front. He and his wife are both urging me. In fact, as recently as last night, they contacted me and asked me when I was going to put it together. And I won't say more about it than that, but I think that's pretty commendable when a Dallas policeman and members of his family are anxious for me to do that. I think that says a lot.
Well, whatever you do, keep us posted, because you certainly have a voice here. No problem at all.
Well, that's great. Well, I appreciate that. And it's been a real slice talking to you, Brent. And as I say, you've got a great voice and a great personality. And I would endorse totally JFK Lancer, and I want to acknowledge Deborah Conway.
Absolutely.
And all the work she does. I want to thank Sherry Feaster, because she really put a nice artistic look and just put a lot of polish on this book for Aubrey and I. She did a commendable job. And I also want to thank Larry Hancock and Stuart Wexler and everybody else that's involved in JFK Lancer and making these things happen for us. Anyway, my best to you, Brent. I hope I hear from you soon.
Thank you so much for coming on the show tonight.
Okay.
All the best, my friend.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye now. Wow, what a great ride, eh, guys? Wasn't he great? That's Colin McSween. He was live all the way from Vancouver, talking about his new book. It's called At the Door of Memory, Aubrey Reich and the Assassination of President Kennedy. And as he said before, you can get it at www.jfklancer.com. I'm going to do that much slower now. www.jfklancer.com. Thanks so much, folks, for listening to Night Fright. I'm your host, Brent Holland. See you next time.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.